In this video, I'm going to share with you a step-by-step pattern for making this cheap amigurumi finger puppet. So let's get started. Hey guys, welcome to DIY Crafts. For this, I'm using cotton 4-ply yarn along with a crochet hook of size 3 mm. Begin with a beige color for the face. Begin with a magic ring. Make chain 1 and then into the center. Make 6 single crochet stitches. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and then 6. Now close the magic ring and let's start making the second row. Make 2 single crochet stitches into the first stitch and then put a stitch marker on the top of the first stitch to mark the beginning of the second row. Now continue to make increases in each and every stitch until you reach the starting point. Increase means we are doing 2 single crochet stitches in each and every stitch. So by the end of the second row, you will have 12 single crochet stitches. Here it's the last increase for the second row. Now for the third row, remove the stitch marker and into the first stitch make 1 single stitch and put the stitch marker back in place to mark the beginning of the third row. Now into the next stitch make 2 single crochet stitches. So now for the third row we are going to repeat this pattern of 1 single stitch and 1 increase throughout the row until you reach the starting point. So by the end of the third row you will have 18 single crochet stitches. So this is the last increase of third row. Now remove the stitch marker and let's start making the fourth row. Begin with 1 single stitch, then put the stitch marker back into the stitch to mark the beginning of fourth row. Now into the next stitch make an increase and in the next stitch make 1 single stitch. Now repeat this pattern of 1 stitch increase and 1 stitch throughout the row. So just don't get confused. It's 1 stitch increase and 1 stitch. So again for the third set you have to again start with 1 single stitch, then increase and 1 single stitch. So likewise once you are done with the fourth row, this is how the pattern looks like and you will have 24 single crochet stitches. Now take out the stitch marker and make 1 single stitch. Put the stitch marker back to mark the beginning of the fifth row. Then make 1 single crochet stitch in each and every stitch for the fifth row, sixth and as well as the seventh row. So by the end of the seventh row you will have all the 5, 6, 7 with equal number of stitches, that is 24 single crochet stitches. So now the seventh row is completed. You can see the shape. This is slowly taking the face shape of the sheep. Now remove the stitch marker and let's start making 8th row. So for this begin with 1 single stitch and then put the stitch marker back to mark the beginning of 8th row. And now into the next stitch make a decrease. So join 2 stitches together using an invisible decrease technique and into the next stitch make 1 single crochet stitch. And now we are going to repeat this pattern of 1 single stitch, 1 invisible decrease and 1 single stitch throughout the row until you reach the starting point. You have to repeat this total of 6 times. So you can consider it as 1 set of 1 single stitch decrease and 1 single stitch. So finally making the last single stitch of the 8th row and this row will have 18 single stitches. Now remove the stitch marker and let's start making the 9th row. So make 1 single stitch and put the stitch marker back to mark the beginning of 9th row. And now into the next stitch make a invisible decrease. So make 1 invisible decrease, again 1 single stitch and then 1 invisible decrease, and this pattern is going to be repeated throughout the row, or you can repeat it 6 times. You can just count it while you are making the stitches so you will not miss any count or any stitch. Making the last decrease of this row and by the end of the 9th row you will have 12 single crochet stitches. Now before you complete the last decrease, change the color as shown in the video. So complete the last single stitch with a new color. Here I am using white color because most of the time sheep will be represented with white, right? So for that change the color. And now remove the stitch marker and then start making the 10th row. So for the 10th row I am going to use only the front loops. Insert the needle into the front loop and then include the tail ends to have the joint secure. Now into this white stitch, make a stitch marker, put a stitch marker to mark the beginning of the 10th row. Now include the tail ends and make one single crochet stitch in the front loops of each and every stitch in the 9th row, so that the 10th row will have 12 stitches in white color. So there won't be any increases or decreases, just a change of color, but the count is not going to change. Make one single stitch in front loops of each and every stitch until you reach the starting stitch. So after few stitches you can trim and cut off the beige color. So we have last few stitches. Make one single stitch in front loops of each and every stitch. So this completes your 10th row with 12 single crochet stitches. Now let's start making the 11th row. So remove the stitch marker. I just forgot making the last one. So remove the stitch marker and then into the first stitch make one single stitch. Here you might see a little difference in the shifting of colors, but don't worry, we are going to adjust it at the end of the video. So we have one single stitch and into the next stitch we have an increase, and now we are going to repeat this pattern of one single stitch and one increase throughout the row until you reach the starting point. So one single stitch and one increase, and by the end of the row you have 18 single crochet stitches. And this completes your 11th row. Now you can add stuffing into the head part. Just don't stuff it as you like. First fill the stuff through the corners or the edges all around the toy, and leave a little space in the center so that your finger can poke through, and then fill in that gap to have a decent stuffing. Now for the next row, make one single stitch and put the stitch marker back, and then make one single crochet stitch in each and every stitch throughout the row until you reach the starting point. So by the end of this row you will have 18 single crochet stitches. Now for the 13th row, remove the stitch marker, make one single stitch into that stitch and put stitch marker back, and then into the next stitch make an increase, that is 2 single stitches into the same stitch. Now into the next stitch make one more single stitch. Now repeat this pattern of one stitch increase and one stitch. So that's one stitch and we have increase, and in the next stitch we have one more stitch. So repeat this pattern throughout the row until you reach the starting point. So here I am making the last single stitch, and by the end of 13th row you will have 24 single crochet stitches. Now remove the stitch marker and let's start making one single stitch and put the stitch marker back to mark the beginning of 14th row. Now make one single crochet stitch in each and every stitch throughout the row until you reach the starting point, and then repeat the same pattern, one single stitch in each and every stitch for the 15th row as well. So in both 14th and 15th rows you will have 24 stitches in each. Now for the 16th row, remove the stitch marker, make one single stitch and then put the stitch marker back in place. Now make 2 more single stitches, so total it's 3 single stitches, and then in the next stitch make an increase. Now we are going to repeat this pattern of 3 single stitches and increase throughout the row until you reach the starting point. So here I am making the last increase of row 16, and by the end of this row you will have 30 single crochet stitches. Now remove the stitch marker, make one single stitch and put the stitch marker back. Then make one single stitch in each and every stitch for the 17th row and also the 18th row. So 17 and 18 rows will have 30 single stitches in each row. And by the end of the 18th row, this is how the toy looks like. It resembles a pawn shape, but we are going to convert it into sheep. So for the next row, make one single stitch and then put the stitch marker back. And now for this row, we are going to make 3 single crochet stitches and then an invisible decrease. So insert the needle into front loops of the next 2 stitches and then make a single stitch. And then continue to make 3 single crochet stitches and then an invisible decrease throughout the row until you reach the starting point. So this one is row 19, and by the end of this row, you will have 24 single crochet stitches. So here I am making the last invisible decrease, and this completes the 19th row. Now for the next row, that's row 20, remove the stitch marker, make one single stitch and then put the stitch marker back in place. Now into the next stitch, make one invisible decrease and then into the later stitch, make one more single crochet stitch. Now repeat this pattern of one single stitch, one invisible decrease and one single stitch throughout the row. So one single stitch, one invisible decrease and then one single stitch, and repeat this pattern throughout the row until you reach the starting point. So here I am making the last single stitch of row 20, and by the end of this row you will have 18 single crochet stitches. Now remove the stitch marker, make one single stitch and put stitch marker back to mark the beginning of row 21. And then make one invisible decrease into the next stitch. So which means we are going to repeat the pattern of one single stitch and one invisible decrease throughout the row. So if you are making it as a toy, continue with the last row of all decreases. If not, you are going to end this pattern here itself to make it as a finger puppet. So remove the stitch marker and then make a slip stitch into the next stitch. Now make chain 1 and fasten off. Leave a small tail end, and this one you can weave in into the stuffing. Now let's add stuffing into the body of the sheep. We have already added enough stuffing to the head. Now let's add the stuffing to the body of the sheep, and make sure you have to stuff through the edges and leave the gap in the middle, and that's how it's easier to make a finger puppet as well. We are going to add a cloth into this hole to make it a finger puppet. And now we are going to start working with the ears of the sheep. So begin with a magic ring, make chain 1 and into the stitch make one single stitch, one half double crochet stitch, then make 3 double crochet stitches, that's 1, 2 and 3. After that make one half double stitch, then one more single stitch and chain 1. Now make slip stitch into the center, then make another chain 1 and fasten off the thread by leaving a little long tail end, and we are going to use this tail end to attach the ear onto the head of the sheep. Now repeat this pattern one more time for the another ear as well. Close the magic ring, and this is how the ears of the sheep looks like. Now put them aside and let's start working the hands of the sheep. I am using the beige color, which is the same as the face of the sheep. Now begin with a magic ring and then make 6 single crochet stitches into the center. That's 3, 4, 5 and 6. Now close the magic ring, make one single stitch into the next stitch, and then we are going to repeat this making of one single stitch in each and every stitch from row 2 to row 7, which means we are having a long stick kind of structure by the end of the 7th row. And it's important to mark the beginning of each and every row because we have to adjust the height of the hand as well. So just repeat this making of one single stitch in each and every stitch, and make sure you stop this at row 7. So once you are done with all the 7 rows, make a slip stitch into the last stitch and then make chain 1 and trim the excess thread by leaving a long tail end, and we are going to use this tail end to attach the hands to the body. Now make one more hand as such and put these two aside. Now let's start making the cap for this sheep. Now begin with magic ring, chain 1, and then into the magic ring make 6 single crochet stitches. That's 3, 4, 5 and 6. Now close the magic ring. Now let's start making row 2. Make 1 single crochet stitch increase in the first stitch, and then put a stitch marker into the first stitch where the second round begins. So we have an increase in the first stitch, and then continue to make increases throughout the row. So that's 2, this one is 3, that's a 4, and then finally the 6th increase. So once we have done the second row, you will have 12 single stitches. Now remove the stitch marker and make an increase into the next stitch, and mark the beginning of the third row with a stitch marker in the first stitch. And for the third row, we are going to make increase in each and every stitch. So 12 stitches will become 24 stitches by the end of the third row. And once the third row is completed, from here on we are going to add a detailing for the sheep. So observe carefully. Begin with 1 single stitch, put the stitch marker to mark the beginning of the 4th row. Now into the next stitch we are going to make a 3DC cluster. So begin with a double crochet stitch and stop halfway. Now make one more double crochet stitch and stop it halfway, and third one into the same stitch and again the double stitch halfway. Now you will have 4 loops on the hook, yarn over and draw through all the 4. So this is a DC cluster, and then into the next stitch make 1 single stitch. Now into the next stitch we are going to repeat to make a DC cluster. So make 3 DC halfway through into the same stitch, and then yarn over and draw through all the 4 loops, and into the next stitch make a single crochet. Now again into the next stitch we are going to make a DC cluster. So DC halfway through into the same stitch for 3 times. Just yarn over, drop a loop and draw the yarn through first 2 loops, and likewise until you have 4 loops on the needle. Yarn over and draw through all the 4 loops on the hook, and then make a single stitch. Now repeat this, and once you are done with making a DC cluster, you have to poke it from the back side to make the stitch pop in the front side. So here, once finishing the last DC cluster of the 4th row, you can see all the cluster stitches are making a flat look. Once you have to poke it from the behind, all your stitches will pop in the front. Now make 1 single stitch and then put a stitch marker to mark the beginning of the 4th row, and then you have to pop it all the stitches from the back side. Now for the 4th row, make 1 single crochet stitch in each and every stitch, which means we will have 1 single crochet stitch over a single stitch and 1 single crochet stitch over a DC cluster as well. And then by the end of this row, again you will have 24 single crochet stitches. Now remove the stitch marker and then start making the 6th row. See, you can see that DC clusters giving that pop look. Now for row 6, we are going to begin with a DC cluster. So make the first DC cluster, and then you can put a stitch marker over this DC cluster. The main reason why we are starting this row with a DC cluster is to make this pop stitches in between each other, and then you will continue to make 1 DC cluster and then 1 single stitch throughout the row. So once you have 4 loops on the hook, yarn over and draw through all the 4 to complete a DC cluster, and into the next stitch make 1 single stitch. And we are continuing this pattern throughout the row until you reach the starting point. Once this row is completed, remove the stitch marker, and this row will also have 24 stitches. Now make 1 single crochet stitch on the top of the DC cluster and put the stitch marker back in its place to mark the beginning of 7th row. Then make 1 single crochet stitch in each and every stitch throughout the row until you reach the starting point. You'll have 1 single crochet stitch over a DC cluster and 1 single crochet stitch over a single stitch. So likewise continue to make 1 single stitch throughout the row until you reach the starting point. Now if you wish, you can add a border to it by making a reverse single stitch. If not, you can just finish it off with the same row, the 7th row only. Once it's done, remove the stitch marker and make a slip stitch into the next stitch. Now chain 1 and then trim the excess thread by leaving a small tail end. We are going to weave in this tail end, or you will use this tail end to attach it at the back side of the head of our sheep. Now if you notice, you have a color change in between your row 9 and row 10. So identify that particular stitch where you have the color change, and now attach the cap in such a way that you are going to hide that color change with this cap. And this is how you will attach this cap. And finally we can secure it using a fabric glue or a hot glue gun. Now let's assemble everything. You can attach them using a tapestry needle and the tail ends as shown in this video. If not, you can attach them using a hot glue gun, whereas you have to hide all the tail ends before you attach them. Okay, once the cap is attached, I am going to attach the ears on either side of the head of the sheep. So before that, I am just tying them by making 2 knots to secure the magic ring and the stitch, and then hide the one of its tail end into the stitches and trim the excess thread. This is how you hide the tail ends. And then using the other tail end, I am going to attach it. Once you can check the positions by putting it on either side, and once you are sure about the position, you can sew it together. These minute detailing and finishings is what it takes the final project looks stunning. So one has to be very careful while making the finishings and also adding the highlights like the eyes or any other kind of stuff. So after attaching the hands, I am securing it with a knot and then hiding the tail end again into the stuffing. And all this mess can be handled if you are using a fabric glue or a hot glue gun. After attaching all the parts, let's add the eyes to the project. Here I am using a pearl head pins to make sure the positioning of the eyes is good enough. And then I am attaching the eyes. I am using kundan stones and attaching them with a fabric glue. But if you are making it for infants or toddlers, make sure you embroider the eyes or use a safety eyes. And once you are done, here I am securing the cap again using the fabric glue. As it is a cotton thread, if I can leave it for some time, it dries out and attaches completely. And if you wish the hands to be like this, you can leave it as it is. If not, attach it using a fabric glue and secure it by using again a pearl head pin so that it will hold its place until the glue gets dried and completely attached. And that's it. Your cute amigurumi sheep finger puppet is ready. I hope you all enjoyed watching this tutorial. Do give this pattern a try and let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. See you all in the next video. Thank you for watching. Please like the video, share it and subscribe to DIY Crafts.